if you think about why emotions exist, right? Like, why does the emotion of interesting exist? Why do we get interested in something, right? Why is that? Why evolutionarily, psychologically, why would we develop the emotion of interesting? His theory was basically something that is interesting is an area in which you have a great capacity for what he calls compression progress. So your ability to take the different components of that and compress it with your existing knowledge and make something, more efficient and useful and interesting is higher. And that's why the emotion interesting exists, because it would make sense evolutionarily that you want to pursue these things which you find interesting because it's an emotion that's indicating sort of a fruitful way to take your skill stack.
This week, I'm sharing part of my conversation with Taylor Pearson. Now, Taylor is an entrepreneur, an investor, and the author of The End of Jobs. In this episode, you're going to hear us talking about Taylor's early career, his decision not to pursue law, the trap of traditional career paths, the silent risk of staying in a job for too long. We talk about the concept that Taylor has of having a personal balance sheet. We also talk about travel and experiencing different cultures, how living abroad affects your personal growth, and finally, Taylor's journey to publishing his book, The End of Jobs, and some of the core concepts of that book. So this was a really enjoyable conversation, and also look out for the next parts because they are also going to be great. You can get the full show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io, and you can find Taylor online on Twitter at TaylorPearsonMe, and in his newsletter, The Interesting Times. Now, if you love this episode, please do share it with a friend, and don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to find other listeners just like you. Okay, so I think one place I'd actually like to start is, so from hearing you speak about your background in the past, I heard that first of all, you majored in history, minored in Spanish, and, you did some year abroad, and then I think you did a year abroad in Argentina, then you moved abroad for work. So before we get to that, because I also want to ask about your time abroad, I would love to know, you ended up going down, there's a chain of cascading events that led you to doing marketing, but it started with you not wanting to do law, and you were a history major, but you were thinking of going to law school. And I found your decision-making process here interesting. I'll let you talk about it, and then I'll ask the questions after.
Yeah. So I guess I wasn't particularly forward-thinking in college. I studied history because I liked it. I just picked the thing I most enjoyed. I took a bunch of classes my first year and the first half of my second year. And I liked history. I liked writing papers. Mostly, right, you just read books and talked about them and then wrote papers about them. And I thought all of that was really fun. And I got to, I think it was the sort of summer after my junior year before starting my final year, and kind of the default path, certainly at my college, I think this is probably true in the US broadly for the most part, is if you do a history undergrad, law school is a very common path. After that, I think there was 17. I went to a small school. I think there were 17 history majors my senior year. And I think 13 probably went to law school or something like that. That was kind of by far the most common thing. And I'm curious what I've said in the past about my decision-making framework. I think I just wasn't excited about it. I think that's where I got to. And it wasn't that risky to not do it for a year and think about it and go back and take the test or whatever. And so my parents thought I was just about to go to law school every year for 5 years after I graduated college, that I would go back. I think most of what I recall thinking about it was I just wasn't excited about it. And, the way the sort of US university system evolved, there was a substantial amount of debt that I was going to need to take on to do law school. So if I did it and didn't like it, it was really hard to get off the path and do something else. And so, yeah, I just kept delaying it. And then eventually, I got to a certain point where I delayed it so long and I had other opportunities and it was no longer something I was thinking about.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's what you said is exactly it. But the thing that I'm interested in is, first of all, loads of people go into law degrees. It's the exact same here in the UK. And I know from lots of people in the US, people end up going and doing law or doing medicine. But what I find interesting about what you said, and knowing that you have now spent a lot of time thinking about decision-making frameworks and a lot of these other things, I'd be interested to know how you think about that same decision. Maybe aside from the fact that you already knew you perhaps weren't super interested in it. But the key part I'm thinking of is the fact that a lot of people probably rationalize themselves into doing law or medicine or some similar degrees simply because the way the kind of mental model works is that the expected value is quite high in a sense, where you probably eat dirt for a few years. You're not earning that much, especially while you're doing law school. Everyone's poor. If you're in medical school, you're going to be poor for a number of years. And then suddenly your pay skyrockets and you're doing extremely well. And then now you're in a very high paying career. And in some of those years, then you just suddenly very quite quickly pay off the debt that you incurred along the way. And I think a lot of people have that framework in mind, and that's how they rationalize themselves into making the exact same decision that you decided not to do. And people just think, because doing some other degrees, you could also rack up a lot of debt for something else that doesn't pay well in the end anyway.
I don't know if I had like the presence of mind. I don't know if I thought this at the time, but I think certainly one lesson I take from that is like the options that are available to you are like not necessarily all the options. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. I went to like a small, not particularly notable school in the Southeast US. And most people from that school went into accounting, legal, I guess, somewhat standard sort of corporate, like working at Wells Fargo, like, kind of that sort of trajectory. And so like, that's kind of what I thought, like, I don't know, like that was just what you did, right? That's just like kind of what I saw people doing. And so I think the first thing I was like, I'm going to take some time and think about, like, do a little exploration and like see what more is going on there. And then I think I made a decision like pretty early on in my life to like, I wouldn't have framed it in these terms, but like not view myself as like homo economicus, like an economic agent, right? Like, oh, I do this and this is trajectory and this is the payoff, right? Because like Paul Graham, one of the Y Combinator founders and writer, has an essay about wealth. And like one of the lines is like, wealth is what you want, right? So like if you had a magic machine and you just told that machine what you wanted and it gave it to you, you would have no use for money, like a dollar, whatever, it would be useless to you, right? You would just tell the machine what you wanted, whatever you wanted, and the machine would produce that sort of thing. So I think my goal was always to find something where I could do good enough financially, with what good enough meant changing over time. But like, I've always put like a reasonable emphasis on like trying to enjoy my day-to-day work and career. I think everyone has certain parts of their work. I'm not blissful all day, every day at work. And I think if I'm going like 6 months and I'm like really sort of miserable at work, like something has to change here. And if that's like economically to my detriment, then I try to figure out a way to make that work.
Yeah, sure. What scares a lot of people is essentially it's just risk, different flavors of risk. And I think perhaps we'll talk a bit about abstractions and heuristics and later, but very often people kind of get onto a path. We both know Paul Millard, who has the book The Pathless Path, and this idea of there is a track that you could very easily go on that leads you through university, and then you do this job, then you do that job, and life could all be so simple. And straying off of that path opens you up to tremendous risk, perhaps, or that's what it seems to be. But I've heard you talk about this idea of simultaneously there's a silent risk of perhaps doing the expected or staying in a job too long.
So I think one of the writers who was very influential on me early on was Nassim Taleb. He has a number of books, Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, Anti-Fragile. Fooled by Randomness, I think, is the best. It's his first book and I think the most straightforward introduction to his work. But he has this fun graph of the lifespan of a turkey. And so like, of course, like the American tradition is like on Thanksgiving, everyone eats a turkey, right? And so, if you are a turkey, he shows this little graphic and it's a turkey standing in front of a whiteboard and he's got this big chart behind him. And every day the turkey's life gets better, right? So the farmer comes out and he puts the food in the trough and, the turkey eats the food and whatever, waddles around with his friends and it's great. Life as a turkey is great, right? He's pointing to this chart and it's just going up and to the right, right? Everything's getting better all the days the turkey comes in. And then, of course, Thanksgiving morning, the turkey's life is not so good. All of a sudden, everything goes bad. And, his point is, if there's lots of things where like, you don't necessarily get like a warning sign, right? It's not like things start to slowly decline. It's like things are good, then things are bad. And it just, it just changes very quickly. And so I think, talking about risk, I think that's an important concept of, I think I use the term silent risk, which is like, actually after my book, The End of Jobs came out, I had a guy reach out to me that I talked to a lot. That was really interesting. He had worked at IBM for, I think 30 years, a long time, 20, 30 years or something. IBM for some period of time I think they called it like a lifetime employment policy, but they basically said, we'll never fire you. Like you started IBM, I think, you started IBM at 22 or something, straight out of university. And, at a certain point that changed. He got laid off. I think he was in his 50s. So he's around his like peak earning years. And he was in a really tough spot because a lot of his like career value and career knowledge was he understood a lot of really specific things about working at IBM that weren't very transferable to another company, right? It was how the hierarchy worked at IBM, or certain IBM products, or how to manage things politically, or certain coworkers, relationships, all that kind of stuff. And so he'd had to sort of go through this multi-year process of sort of reinventing himself and coming up with a new career and trying to figure things out. And so I think that's a lot of stuff when people talk about, oh, this is the safe path or this is the safe trajectory. I think it's like, what depends on what your definition of safe is and like what is safe really, right? So like pointing to this thing has worked for the last 10 years. Okay, that's a data point, but like, can we necessarily say like that's safe per se? And I think, I think that's the case with like a lot of jobs. I know there's been like the US tech sector's had quite a few layoffs, and like most people in those layoffs, I don't think saw it coming, right? They weren't sitting there going, I'm probably going to get laid off 12 months from now, right? They thought, oh, this is great. I've got this great job. Everything's going well. And it's, maybe I'm not happy, but at least it's safe kind of thing. And so I think I challenge that with a lot of people because I think, especially if you love it and you're super passionate about it and it's the thing you want to spend your life on, like that's great. Maybe it is risky, but good for you. And if that makes sense, given everything else you're doing in life, that's awesome. Like a lot of times the safety thing, it's like a way of sort of saying like, I'm afraid or I'm worried. And instead of like talking about that directly, you're just sort of like appealing to this notion of safety that like may or may not exist.
I think what you were saying just now, well, just a moment ago about IBM made me think of when I spent some time a while ago working in China, working in Shanghai. And a friend of mine was telling me that I think a lot of young Chinese people, probably getting into their mid-20s, by probably about 25, people start having existential crises because there are so many people. There are lots of jobs, but there's also a lot of people. And so whatever job you're doing, by the time you're 25, at least this is how people think about it, that's going to be the job for the rest of your life. And, in Japan, for example, they won't fire you there either. And so it's not like you're going to lose your job, but it also doesn't mean you can switch jobs. So it's almost the inverse risk of like, once you pick a path, you're stuck on that path. And that's actually going to be it. It's not even like you have the option to switch paths. But just on what you were saying about just the idea of risk and how people can either the perceived risk that they see is too high or they just don't fully appreciate the value of risk. I think this links to another thing that I've heard you mention in the past, but I think is also from Nassim Taleb, which is this idea that I think the analogy that Nassim Taleb used was, it's links to ergodicity, and it's the idea that jumping off a 1-foot wall 50 times is not the same as jumping off a 50-foot wall one time. And the way I think about it as well, something that came to my mind, I think in the last week or so, I was at the train station, and you've been to London, you came last year. Sometimes on the London Underground, you will see there's going to be the escalators, but there'll also be the stairs, and they put a warning on the stairs and they tell you exactly how many stairs they are, especially if it's going to be long. So they'll say this stairwell has X number of stairs, just because you can't see it before you start taking the stairs, and that warning has to be there so people know exactly what they're signing up for once they start taking the stairs. But I think the funny thing is that when you have to take the stairs in an emergency, people obviously end up hating it. But a big part of that reason is because people don't do the small hard thing that you could do every day, which is taking the stairs. And so when you're forced to do a much bigger hard thing, it feels so much worse. And I think in that same process, people take away the wrong lesson. So every day, people avoid taking the stairs, even though incrementally, like just day to day, it's not that bad. You could take the stairs on a normal day, but people will avoid the small inconvenience of taking the stairs on a regular day. And then on the one day that you're actually forced to take the stairs, it feels like the worst thing in the world. And then once you do that, you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that again. And so from that point on, then you continue to avoid the stairs. Whereas if you took the stairs regularly on a normal day, just small stairs, then by the time, if there's an emergency, there's a fire drill, or you actually are required to use the stairs, then, it feels relatively easier.
Yeah, I like that example. And I think of like, I have no data whatsoever to support this, but just like total anecdotal observation. Like I meet some people that have, talked to some people that are very intelligent people that have worked at like large companies for long periods of time. And in a certain way, they just by necessity, right? Like you're working at Amazon or something, like your whole job is like 2 pages, managing 2 pages on like the Seller Central dashboard or whatever, a lot of that just like isn't very transferable to like other things, right? Like it's just extremely specific to that particular company. And so I think there's a lot of situations like that where like, to me, I think I can make a reasonable case that that's like quite a risky thing to do, right? As you said, if you start your career, you work for some period like at a small company or a startup or freelance or whatever, like the skills you get there tend to be a lot more generalizable, right? The equivalent of like jumping off one stair 50 times. And like applicable to a lot of other situations in a way that certain big companies I'm thinking of, you get sort of like put in this really niche specific thing that's just like not particularly transferable. And like, that's a risky thing, right? Because like your economic value, right? Like maybe you're making a really great salary, but like your economic value is very tied to like this particular thing, right? Like one product on Amazon Web Services, whatever the thing you're doing is. So I think like from my view, it's like the important thing is like, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you enjoy it or, you make a ton of money, whatever, great, good for you. But like, let's not say that this is like necessarily safe or smart or robust. This is like a risky thing that you're doing and you're sort of comfortable with that risk. I don't think that doesn't tend to be how people think about it, right? They tend to think about that's like the smart, safe thing to do. And, something where you're going to work at a smaller company or start your own thing or whatever it is a lot more risky. And I don't think that's like a really reasonable assessment of like career risk, right? That like having a broad experience of generalizable and transferable skills feels to me like that's like a much less risky thing to do, right? That your ability to, turn that and do other things with that is much higher.
Yeah. But what I find interesting about that, though, is I feel like I can see both sides. And the irony is that most people don't. And that's why they stay stuck. So the end question I want to ask you is, how you think people can functionally escape the sunk cost of whatever position they're stuck in or whatever role they're doing. But I think, just going off the back of what you were saying, I spent about 5 years in corporate law. And I definitely think that people severely underestimate how transferable some of the skills they're learning are, or at least how powerful some of the skills they were learning are, if they applied them to other domains. But the problem is they are applying that exact same skill set to the exact same domain over and over again and just optimizing for getting better at that. Whereas if you took some of those skills and you applied them somewhere else, actually you would realize these feel like superpowers. And I guess the analogy that I would give is that it's a bit like thinking that you have superpowers because you get really good at cultivating spiders instead of letting the spider bite you and then you get to become Spider-Man. Like if you took that little bit of risk of letting the spider bite you, the asymmetry of a future where you're Spider-Man is far greater than being the person that gets to grow the spiders. But you still have the same proximity to that, the potential of having that alternate timeline. I know that probably sounds a little bit complicated, but that's kind of the way I think about it, where,
I love a good Spider-Man analogy.
But yeah, go on.
No, I think there's like it's interesting. Like I've hired people like directly out of college. Like there are like a lot of work skill, like how to write an email. You know what I mean? Is like an underrated and important work skill. Like it's like a surprisingly non-obvious thing to do, or like, how to manage your calendar and stuff like it, which like, it sounds like kind of pedantic, but like, it's actually not pedantic. Like if you're like good at responding to your email and showing up at appointments on time, that's pretty good. You can do a lot with that. A lot of people. So I don't know. I'm always like, there's a bit of this like lionization of entrepreneurship in the culture at the moment. And I'm always like really hesitant. I'm always hesitant about like sort of not playing into that kind of thing. And I think one thing else, like most people, this is again, my sort of experience, like most people that have like been successful, like working their way up some like competitive corporate career, spinning that into starting a business or working in a smaller company, like just a general like grit, competence, raw intelligence, all those filters, like you've kind of probably passed through all those filters at that point. And like your ability to make that switch, in my experience, is like pretty good. I think there's usually like a, 3-year transition period, or there is some transition period of like figuring that out kind of thing. But no, I think that's right. Like there is a certain transferability there. I don't know. I'm curious what you think. Like it seems like maybe the later you wait, it gets a little bit harder, especially like given earning expectations. If you're at like 45 or 50 at sort of peak earning years and like trying to do that and get back to peak earning in a new career, that seems like it might be a little bit harder, but I'm not sure.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision-making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And that's where all my friends are stuck. I think that's the thing, right? Okay. So it's both in terms of your compensation and both in terms of the skill set. If you stay long enough just to pick up the skills and then you can take them and apply them elsewhere, I think that's the peak option. Well, that's what I did. I think that's the peak option. We will see. Right now, I am still very much feeling jealous of some of my friends who will be listening to this that are still at the firm that I was at, who are earning, very well, and a lot of people from my cohort. But I think the thing is that the longer you stay just applying the same skill set to the same problem, it almost starts to diminish. I think the potential upside diminishes because then you get trained too much to apply it very narrowly and you don't know it anymore how to apply that skill set broadly. And then on top of that, that's compounded by the compensation that you get. So then the benefit that you could potentially get by leaving and actually trying to, because it does necessitate starting from the bottom a bit, taking that skill set and moving it elsewhere, you do have to learn and you have to start pattern matching. And that requires, there is the emotional risk there of actually having to, it takes some humility. It takes some, you have to put yourself out there to learn in other domains.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is like the idea of like a personal balance sheet, right? So like a business will have a balance sheet that like shows all its assets, right? It owns a factory and a car and, whatever, and it has this much cash in the bank and like those sorts of things. So like a person has a balance sheet too, and you can like think of that in strictly financial terms. You have whatever money you have in the bank and you have a car and whatever you own and that kind of stuff. But like I think there's like two other ways to like broaden the concept of balance sheet that are interesting. One is thinking about like, as you said, like human capital, right? So like if you're learning very fast, right, you're acquiring a lot of new knowledge, hopefully that's like somewhat transferable. Like even if you're not making that much money, like you could factor that into the balance sheet too, right? Like, okay, maybe I didn't make that much money over this period, or I made a lot of money and I learned a lot of skills. Okay, that's really interesting, right? But I think how I'm interpreting what you're saying, right, is like you also get in these periods where like maybe you're earning a lot of money, but like the human capital part of so like the financial balance sheet looks good. But at a certain point, maybe the human capital side of the balance sheet isn't that much more interesting than it was 5 years earlier, or isn't that much more compelling than it is 5 years earlier. And like, there's a cost associated with that. All right. That's a trade-off that's being made. Maybe I think a lot of people don't think about explicitly. And I think you can even broaden the concept more and say, there's also like, how you feel about your life. That's like part of that balance sheet, right? Like, is it whatever? Am I enjoying what I'm doing? Is this meaningful to me? Like all those sorts of like existential questions start to come in. And so I think it's like, I think about that a lot. I think one sort of interesting investing analogy is if you're investing in a company, people often do something what's called a discounted cash flow analysis, right? So you'll try and project out the cash flows of the company and its earnings and its costs and all this kind of stuff and what the profits can be. And you'll work backwards from that to determine like what an appropriate valuation is today, right? What I'm willing to pay for this company. And like one of the biggest variables in that calculation is how long you expect those earnings to persist for, right? So if you have a company that's making a lot of money, but doesn't have much of a competitive advantage and those earnings go away in 3 years, the present value is a lot less than a company that has pretty good profits, but has a very durable competitive advantage and can last over a long time. And so I think, in principle, that's true of an individual as well, right? It's like if you do something where it's reasonably valuable and you're reasonably good at it and you can do it for a reasonably long time on your, discounted cash flow analysis, it's actually worth a lot because it can persist over a long period of time. I think some people get, folks say like, oh, I can make a lot of money doing this for the next year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever. But actually, maybe it's better to think about what could I do for the next 20 years? Or what would that look to think in that time frame, and like, what would that look like and how would I do things differently?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to mix analogies here, but the way I'm thinking about it in my mind is, okay, so on one hand, it's a bit like the 80-20 of in most jobs and in most careers, you spend 80% of the time getting good and then 20% of the time getting great. But you have to get good first. And once you get good, that you've got the 80% and the 20% is just optimizing. And so the other way of thinking about it is getting good at the skill and getting good at the game. The skill is the 80%, but that is just onboarding, slightly beyond onboarding, but like getting to a point where you are competent and, you're good enough to be dangerous. That is the 80%. And then the 20% is the game. So first you get good at the skill, then you get good at the game. But the problem is that the actual time allocation is the inverse of that. So how long does it take to get the 80%? 20% of the time. And then you spend 80% of the time on the remaining 20%, and that is the rest of the career. And so using law as an analogy, but it applies to other careers as well, is that people within the first few years of being in that career, you do the 80%, you get good at the skill. And then the rest of the entire time span of that career is like working your way up to partner. That's getting good at the game. That's the only 20%. And so I think that's the part where, in your analogy, that goes on the other side of the balance sheet where you're not actually building the skill anymore in terms of the human capital. You are just optimizing for the game and just getting good at applying it within this very specific domain. And that is useful as long as you keep playing the game. That is super useful. But once you stop playing the game, you actually realize that you've spent however many years just optimizing for the final 20%. And the rest of that time, you haven't actually spent that developing on the other side of your skill set.
Right. No, I like that. That's very interesting. At that point, your trajectory becomes very path dependent, right? You have to stay on that path and keep playing that game for it to sort of be successful in the long run. Yeah, I think there's a blogger I like. His name's Venkatesh Rao. He has a blog post. I think it's called The Compass and the Gyroscope, or that's the sort of analogy he uses. There's the idea of like an external versus an internal coordinate system, right? So like a compass is an external coordinate system. You have the north, south, east, west, and you look at a map and you sort of navigate it. And a gyroscope has sort of an internal system, right? It's rolling downhill. I'm not going to describe very well mechanically how a gyroscope works, but I think people can sort of visualize it. And I think about that analogy a lot too, because I think sort of to your point of like the skill versus the game is like, it's the more sort of like clear the map is in general, I think it's just like more competitive, right? Like getting to partner at a law firm or being a renowned surgeon in a particular, like it's really hard. It's just really, it's like being a professional athlete, right? Like what percentage of kids want to be a professional athlete when they're like 10 years old? Like it's really hard. And so this idea of like a gyroscope, or maybe you're picking up some skills here and some skills there, you're sort of following an internal coordinate system that's not leading down a necessarily known map or known road. I think it's Paul's like pathless path idea, but does still have a certain logic to it, right? Things do stitch together in a certain way in which those skills are complementary and useful. They are not in a way that is easily explained to someone on the outside in the same way that you made partner to a law firm, or you went to a good law school, or you did this or that sort of specific accomplishment.
Yeah. So I'm interested to apply this too, going back to your career path. So after you left college, I think you spent some time working abroad, and you mentioned that, or maybe this was, I think actually before that, in your second year of college, you had a year abroad, and then coming back, you had like a reverse culture shock that made you want to go back out again. And I'd love to know more about how you felt in that moment and what felt like the most impactful. Like, what did you see that felt, I don't know, life-changing or paradigm shifting that you then came back and felt like, something's different, something's missing?
I think for me, that experience, I did. It was my third year, my junior year. I spent a year in Argentina. I was a Spanish minor, and my Spanish was not very good. And so I thought if I went and spent a year in Argentina, my Spanish would have to get good. I lived with like a host family, like an older woman. I lived in like the spare bedroom in her house and went to the university there. And I think, yeah, that was impactful for two reasons. I think one, when I got there, my Spanish was really bad, like really bad. Like, I don't know. I can't stress how bad it was, embarrassingly bad. And the first, depressed is a strong term, but like the first month or two were like really hard. Like my classes were in Spanish. It's like, imagine if, whatever, didn't speak any Russian, you're like chained down in a Russian university. And like, I literally didn't know what they were saying. You know what I mean? Like literally, I couldn't understand the words that were coming out of their mouth. And yes, it was really tough. And so I would like go home with my like host mother, and I would like sit there with like my Spanish English dictionary open and like try and talk to her, and I'm like looking up words, and like we're pointing, she's pointing at stuff and she's telling me what the word, like, like I'm a 4-year-old basically, right? Like a young child. And by the end of it, my Spanish was decent. Like I was conversationally functional, but like I could like go to a university class and like in Spanish and like get, 98% of what they were saying and be a functional thing. And so I think that was just like a huge confidence boost for me that I have done this hard thing, that I was clearly very bad when I showed up and I was like reasonably competent when I left. And so I think that gave me like a lot of courage to like try something else, to do something a little bit different and not necessarily go to law school or kind of go down the default trajectory. And I think the other thing relates back to what I said earlier, which is just like, it was a different experience in like ways I couldn't have imagined, right? There's, you talk about like there's the known knowns and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? So this was it was an unknown unknown, right? It was different culturally, historically, sort of all those different components in ways I hadn't even really thought about. And so I think that gave me a certain, like, maybe there's other things I haven't thought about that are different about how the world works. Like, I wanted to explore that some. And so I think, I wanted to go live abroad again after that, just because that, for me at that point, like, that was one way in which that was very visceral, just living in a different culture, people speaking a different language, and like seeing what that was like.
Yeah, sure. That reminds me a bit of, like I mentioned, I went to China as well, and it was a very similar experience. Although I had studied Chinese a bit, and that was kind of the point. So originally, actually, before going to university, my original plan was I wanted to go and work at a Chinese university. I got like 2 offers through my Chinese teacher to go and, teach English at a university there. And my dad said no, so I didn't get to do it. But, but then during university, then I had an opportunity to go. I was actually working at a law firm there, so to connect two of our lines. But in the first month, I was doing half days. So I would go to work for the first half of the day and then go to language school for the second half of the day. And at the language school, they did not speak English. They would only speak to you in Chinese. And then at work, obviously, people are only speaking in Chinese. And it was so hard. Particularly that first month was just grueling because, people also, like, culturally, they would have lunch together at work. And so, first of all, I didn't even know how to use chopsticks. So I had to learn that in front of everyone. So it's like hugely embarrassing. Everyone's sitting around this big table having lunch together and I'm trying to figure it out. It actually took a while. And then going from there to language school where they're only going to speak to you in Chinese, but you actually get better quite quickly. And I remembered one situation because you mentioned Russian. They sent me to go and meet with some guys. Obviously, the whole point I'm there is because I speak English, right? And so I'm meant to be really good at English. That's how I got the job. I had some of the best exam grades in the world at English. And so they sent me to go and meet these, white people. They were from Russia. And the joke was when I actually got there to meet them, they did not speak English. They spoke Russian and they also spoke Chinese. And so, and so the only language I could speak to them in was Chinese because I was, I'd been learning Chinese. This guy spoke Chinese and also Russian. I know no Russian. And so I was just stuck there trying to figure out how to negotiate things. But the other thing, how I was going to tie that back was you had mentioned this idea that I think also connects to something we were talking about, which is when you go to a new place, you kind of get to try out some different versions of yourself, right? You are unconstrained by your typical environment. People usually know you as one person and in one way. And when you move somewhere else, you get to, not that you have to be different, but you get to try to be different. You get to be a bit more explorative and you can push some of the boundaries that you might typically be stuck within. And it was funny, there was a post that I came across on Reddit that was reshared on Twitter. So unfortunately, the person that shared it didn't get to see the revelation that occurred. But the person that was making the post was talking about his life and basically he was miserable, right? He had this job washing dishes, working early hours of the morning. He was just working in this restaurant, washing dishes. It wasn't fun. He was arguing with his girlfriend all the time. I think they'd recently broken up. He had these friends that he wasn't really friends with them anymore and they've kind of disconnected and none of them were really doing anything well either. He'd been trying to save some money to move, but not enough that he hadn't saved enough to move. He'd saved enough. What he did was he stopped renting the apartment he was renting. He got a van. He was living in the van and he managed to save about 15,000, but he didn't feel like he'd saved enough to move. And the comment that I saw, which was now on Twitter where this post had been reshared, is that this guy is completely miserable. But how happy would he be if someone whacked him over the head and he completely forgot everything about his current life? All the constraints that he sees, to the girlfriend that he argues with, the job that he's supposed to show up at. If he didn't know he had to show up at that job, he just woke up with no memories like Jason Bourne. He has a van that he could stay in. He has $15,000 in the bank. Like that is actually a pretty great fresh start. If you didn't know anything else and you have $15,000, you've got a van, you've got some clothes, some belongings. That's actually a much better position to be in than a lot of people. But when you're stuck in that position, you can't really see that. Like you can't climb out of the situation that you're already in to see things with fresh eyes.
And I think that's hard. For me, that's been perpetually hard, right? You just don't. I think there's a David Foster Wallace bit where he's talking about there's 2 fish swimming. They're like just swimming at each other and they swim past each other in the water. And one fish turns to the other fish and goes, "Water's nice today." And the other fish looks back and goes, "What the fuck is water?" Right. And it's like, well, it's a fish. Why water is nothing. Right? It's like, why would you even comment on it? You're in water all the time. Right. I think it's hard to see those things and see like, oh, this is water.
Yeah, so in The End of Jobs, your book, you talk about this idea of developing skill stacks and, using that as a way of traversing through the working world. And I think, a big part of the emphasis of your book was becoming more entrepreneurial and kind of using the skills that you developed to become more entrepreneurial. I would love to know about your personal skill stack because you've had a really interesting background. And I think so maybe there's two layers of the question. The first layer is, how do you think you've gone about building your skill stack? Is there any way that you've thought about learning things in particular that you found useful? Just because, like tracking some of the things you've been interested in. First of all, okay, starting with majoring in history, minoring in Spanish, getting into marketing and learning all the skills you need to get there without going through any real formal process. You kind of did that very manually. Going from there to becoming a writer, both publishing your book and also writing quite prolifically online. Then going from there to being an investor. I think at one point you got interested in complexity studies. You seem to have taught yourself a lot of things along that path. So I'd love to hear you talk a bit more about that.
Yes, let me see if I can answer sort of both levels of the question at the same time. I think there's a paper I wrote a summary of some years ago. It's called Optimize for Interesting. I think that the guy that wrote it, I believe, was an AI researcher. And if you think about why emotions exist, right? Like, why does the emotion of interesting exist? Why do you get interested in something, right? Like, why is that? Why evolutionarily, psychologically, like, why would we develop the emotion of interesting? And his theory was basically something that is interesting is an area in which you have a great capacity for what he calls compression progress. So your ability to like take the different components of that and compress it with your existing knowledge and like make something, more efficient and useful and interesting is higher. And that's why the emotion interesting exists, because it would make sense evolutionarily that you want to pursue these things which you find interesting because it's an emotion that's indicating sort of a fruitful way to take your skill stack, as you described it. And so I think that's always sort of been the way I've tried to think about it, is like, okay, what am I doing now? And like, what is interesting that is like somewhat adjacent to that? And like, that's going to kind of I'm going to spend my free time. That's what I'm reading about. That's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm looking at. And even though it's not directly applicable to maybe what I'm doing now, it's interesting to me. And so I'm just going to sort of take it on some faith that there's some ability for compression progress, that there's something I can do in that direction. So I guess sort of my career progression. My first job was I was a Spanish interpreter. And that was my one marketable skill coming out of university. I took a night class my senior year to get, I don't know if I was officially licensed. I had some badge or something, but I was doing interpretation. So I did that. It's like that was sort of my first freelance gig. And then I got a job as an English teacher in Brazil. I said I wanted to go abroad again. And so I moved to Brazil and I taught English for a while. I didn't love teaching English for a number of reasons. And so I had gotten interested in digital marketing. And I just think this was sort of early 2010s and like search engine optimization. All this stuff was kind of coming online. And I went to Amazon and I bought every book on search engine optimization at the time, which I think there were 3 books. I think there's probably 30,000 of them now. And I built some websites to basically teach myself SEO. I think my most successful website was collegefurniture.net. And it was like reviews of like furniture you would use at college. So like futon reviews and nightstand reviews, whatever. And I think at its peak, I made like $300 a month or something. And I was like pretty jazzed about my $300 a month from the site. But that sort of set me on like my initial career trajectory. I was able to parlay that. $300 a month wasn't sustainable. So when I left my English teaching job, I got a job in a marketing agency, and I cold emailed a bunch of marketing agencies and said, hey, look, I know SEO. Here's my website. Here's all the SEO stuff I did. Will you give me a part-time job? And so I got a part-time job, and that turned into a full-time job. I worked there for a while. I started doing sort of other digital marketing adjacent things, email marketing, pay-per-click, a bunch of stuff like that. That got turned into, I got a job at an e-commerce company that was based between some in California, some in East Asia. We had a team in like the Philippines and Vietnam and China. And so I moved out. I was in Vietnam for a couple of years working for them. And I sort of progressed from just doing marketing. They had a number of different hospitality equipment brands. So we sold like parking equipment, bar equipment, stuff like that. And I ended up running one of those brands. And so I kind of got out of marketing and I was doing more operational stuff. I was kind of overseeing the whole brand and sort of not just the marketing piece of it. And then that company got sold. And at that point, it's when I sort of wrote my book, The End of Jobs, and started doing basically consulting, freelancing stuff around that, sort of e-commerce marketing and e-commerce operation stuff. And at that time, I just got like really interested in finance. So I just started like reading like a bunch of finance books. I was doing like a little bit of investing, like nothing particularly crazy. I got very interested in the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin stuff. I thought that was very fascinating as like a blend of technology and finance. And so sort of my consulting progressed to be a little bit more focused around financial services companies, that sort of industry. And sort of in that process, I met my now business partner, who was a trader by background or a finance person by background, and we started a small fund. So that's what I sort of run day to day now. But the trajectory there's a certain linearity to me looking back. I think sort of, as you mentioned, some of these ideas around like complexity and anti-fragility have always been really interesting to me. And I've in different areas thought about how those things apply, but I felt was always sort of on this trajectory of like kind of what's interesting and how can I sort of incorporate that more into what I'm doing.
Sure. What was the process like of publishing The End of Jobs?
So the self-publishing, I know you've had Eric Jorgensen on the podcast, who's the CEO of Scribe now. So I was one of Scribe's very early customers. I don't know how early I was, but it was before it was called Scribe. They had a previous name. So when I published the book, I've always enjoyed writing. I liked history. I started blogging when I was at my e-commerce job, kind of on the side. And so that was kind of what enabled me. That was like my Saturday project for like 3 or 4 years. You know, I would wake up Saturday morning and I would go to a coffee shop and I was like working on my blog. And that was, I guess, people work on newsletters now, not blogs, but kind of same concept. So I had a blog and I had done a fair amount of writing about these ideas of just like future of work and how the internet was affecting careers. And, you know, it was at some level just sort of like a reflection on my own career, my own path, right? Like how did I sort of end up in what was very different from a sort of a law school trajectory, that I was like a brand manager at an e-commerce company in Vietnam, right? It's just it was a very different trajectory than sort of like where I'd expected to be if you'd asked me 5 years earlier. And so, yeah, I just decided it would be cool to like write a book. I'd written a lot about it. And so I was like, I'll kind of take these things and I'll stitch them together into a book. Yeah, I was very fortunate. I had like some friends that helped me promote it and it got a bit of traction and did a lot better than I expected, honestly. And I really enjoyed it. I liked writing. So it was painful at times, but overall enjoyable.
Fair. If you were to write an update to the book now, what beliefs would you update? So what's changed in your thinking from what you previously wrote, or is there anything new that you've learned since?
I have like a whole chapter like railing on accountants. And a month before I published the book, I met my now wife, who's an accountant. So I would probably change that chapter. There's one major update I would make. My views on the future of accounting have become more nuanced and sophisticated over time. Certainly there's roles for good accountants in the future. Yeah, I mean, I think the basic thesis of the book was basically like the internet opens up a lot of these new sort of like niche business opportunities that don't work in geographic worlds. One of the brands at the e-commerce company I worked for was we sold like sort of like high-end boutique, well-designed cat furniture. It would be like your cat litter box would fit into like, it looked like a mid-century modern sort of side table, right? So you could like put it next to your nice mid-century modern couch and, you know, the cat could go in and like use the litter box or whatever. And that business only makes sense on the internet, right? There's no geographic location where there's a sufficient quantity of people that want to buy enough mid-century modern cat furniture to like make that a viable business, right? Like maybe New York or London or Tokyo, but it's not like the business works a lot better on the internet because across the world, there like are enough of those people, right, that have that particular design aesthetic and have a cat and want their place to look nice or whatever. And I just thought that was like so fascinating. Like that was a viable, like that was a real business. Like it was a multiple 6-figure business that could sustain a person and, you know, had a manufacturer and all that kind of stuff. And sort of through that process, I just met a lot of other people running similar types of businesses, right? That there were all these sort of, would kind of get called like long tail, if you will, businesses, relatively niche businesses that were economically viable in sort of the internet era. And yeah, I mean, I think broadly, like that's still true. Like there's still a lot of podcasting is certainly one thing that's exploded, right, in the last 10 years. Like the number of things there's podcasts for that like are real businesses now is like insane, right? Like all these really niche, there's a particular like college football team in the US that I like. That's like the team I grew up in. Like there's like people that like run a full-time job. It's like it's a podcast for people that are fans of this one college football team in the US, right? And there's there's 1,000 people that are willing to pay $10 a month to like hear the commentary about this team, right? Because they're super into it and they want to hear the latest of what's going on in the recruiting and that kind of stuff. So I think that sort of core thesis is intact. I think like the specific examples have probably like evolved some like how those businesses get started and where you get into it. But I wouldn't like change a lot. Like I think sort of like core concepts are pretty decent and still work. I'd probably just sort of update it, take out the accounting stuff so I don't have to hear my wife tell me about how I was wrong about that.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.